Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. Where we last left the story of the 26 counties back in 1959, Dev had finally departed the stage. If not for his eternal reward, then for the presidency, which was the next best thing. During his lifetime, he had dominated the Irish political scene as nobody before or since, but he certainly yielded to the temptation to hang on too long. By now, he was almost blind and had to have cabinet papers read out to him by his secretary. A secondary disadvantage of clinging on too long, overstaying his time in office, was that his anointed successor, Sean Lemass, was now somewhat long in the tooth himself, becoming Taoiseach at the age of 60, the most geriatric of all first-time Taoiseach. That was unfortunate because Lemass had a lot of dead wood to clear away, and although he set about his task with a will, if he had ascended to the throne a few years earlier, undoubtedly he would have brought more energy to the task. Now, according to all the useful statistics that the newly formed Institute of Public Administration was churning out, Ireland in the late 1950s was in an economically miserable state. 400,000 young people emigrated during the decade of the 50s. The population of the country at 2.8 million was 5% less than it had been at the time of the creation of the state 40 years earlier. All this despite a remarkably high birth rate. The economy, likewise, was growing at a microscopic pace, an average of 1% per annum between 1950 and 58, while other Western European countries were enjoying the most extraordinary boom in human history. There's a definite sense then that a comprehensive shake-up in the Irish way of doing things was long since overdue. And this, during Lemass's tenure, was provided by one of the more remarkable public servants ever to work in Irish state administration, an economist in the Department of Finance named Dr. T.J. Whittaker. Finance, as you know, had always been a temple of conservatism and ossified thinking, and as such an unlikely place for radical ideas to emerge. But Whittaker, at this time just 40 years of age, was a member of the first generation of Irish civil servants to have joined the public service since the foundation of the state. He'd never worked for the pre-independence British civil service, and in consequence had not been infected by what has aptly been called the politics of the cultural cringe. That is to say, waiting to see what the British do and slavishly following it. For him, it was high time that Ireland struck out on her own course. Whittaker was also deeply concerned about the scourge of emigration, which was depriving the country of precisely that cohort that was most valuable in economic terms. Young people in their late teens and early 20s fresh out of school. Ireland needed more of these, not fewer. As things stood, all the country was doing was educating its bright young people at its own expense, and then making a free gift of them to economic competitors overseas, rather like feeding a cow and letting somebody else milk it. In 1957 then, even before Lemass appeared on the scene, Whittaker began working on a lengthy policy paper, a blueprint, if you will, for kickstarting Ireland Inc., which was published the following year under the unexciting title of Economic Development. This document did have one major flaw. It had 4 main points instead of the statutory 3. But each of these blew a large hole in long-standing Fianna Fáil economic policy. The first was a proposal to remove the tariff barriers set in place by DEV in the early 1930s to encourage native industries, something that obviously hadn't worked. The second was a shift in the focus of public expenditure from social goals like housing to infrastructure aimed at greasing the wheels of the economy. The third was a suggestion to adopt Keynesian demand management, the doctrine of the economist J.M. Keynes. In other words, to use government spending to increase consumer purchasing power, if necessary, facing the consequence of a reduction in foreign currency reserves. The last proposal was to encourage inward investment from overseas, foreign direct investment, or FDI, which would involve repealing the Control of Manufacturers Acts of the 1930s that had kept the commanding heights of Irish industry, the economy such as it was, in Irish hands. Even though all of these were contradictions of what Lemass himself had done as Minister of Industry and Commerce back in his youthful days, the new Taoiseach, aware that his previous nostrums weren't yielding results, now threw his weight behind Whitaker, and economic development was adopted largely wholesale at the end of '58, even before Lemass became Taoiseach. It now was government policy, rechristened the First Programme for Economic Expansion, a 5-year plan for bringing productivity and hence living standards in Ireland up to the Western European average. In retrospect, the first programme appears to be a surprisingly modest scheme. It emphasised agriculture over industry as the leading sector in the Irish economy, something that would have warmed the cockles of Cumann Gael's heart back in the 20s. Even though Lemass himself was convinced, and rightly so, that only industrial development could achieve the increase in prosperity on the scale that was necessary for Ireland to catch up to her neighbours. The targets that the programme set for the economy were also highly conservative. It envisaged growth rates of just 2% a year, which is something that nowadays would be considered stagnation. Still, the first programme was more important for the precedent it set than what it actually did. For the first time since the 1930s, the Irish government was daring to confront the possibility that the economy wasn't just something that happened, the state of which fluctuated for incomprehensible and uncontrollable reasons like the weather, but to the contrary, it was actually possible to influence the country's economic fate. Needless to say, though I'll say it anyway, this was a doctrine with as many dangers as opportunities, especially if you didn't know what you were doing, as it soon turned out Irish ministers really didn't. But at some time, the country was going to have to break out of its neo-colonial mentality and begin taking chances and making its own mistakes, regardless of what its neighbour to the east did or didn't do. The only surprise is that it took so long. Now, if you want to measure it by results, the first programme was a roaring success. From an average growth rate of 1%, as I say, in the 1950s, a rate of 4% per annum was maintained between 1959 and 1973. Not in the Japanese league, certainly, but pretty good nonetheless. In fact, it's likely that this was as much the result of the booming world economy during the 1960s as anything the Department of Finance was doing or not doing. One would need to be pretty dim in the decade of the 60s not to be making money at that time. And undoubtedly, the second and third programs for economic expansion, introduced in 64 and 67 respectively, were little more than calls for more of the same. I think neither of them had very much of an impact. Both were shelved before their allotted terms were completed. But the logjam had been broken all the same, and all sorts of heretical ideas now began to come to the fore. Ireland applied for EEC membership as early as 1961, and although her application was rejected by a kindly President de Gaulle of France, who thought, no doubt correctly, that she wasn't ready yet, it was clear just the same that Lamasse's government was eager to break with the old ideas of economic self-sufficiency, autarky, and instead go for growth and an export-led economy. As a first step, a free trade agreement was concluded with Britain in 1965 that called for all tariffs between the two countries to be abolished within 10 years. In other words, Irish companies would have to be capable of competing on level terms with British counterparts by that time. This was seen as a move toward eventual EEC entry. If Ireland could hold her own against British competition economically, she probably could manage to do so with the rest of Europe as well. The 60s also witnessed the beginning of a social revolution in Ireland, as elsewhere in the Western world. It was a demographic turning point in which the Civil War generation of politicians passed away, both figuratively and literally, and the first generation of those born since independence took their place. In Fianna Fáil, these bright young men were people like Donogh O'Malley, Lamasse's Minister of Education, Jack Lynch, Minister for Industry and Commerce, and the soon-to-be notorious Charlie Haughey, Minister of Agriculture. In Fine Gael, the new blood was represented by Liam Cosgrave, WT's son. Okay, admittedly he'd been around for a while. Garrett Fitzgerald, whom we've already mentioned in the context of Northern Ireland, and Richie Ryan. In Labour, people like Brendan Corish, the party leader, Justin Keating, and to a certain extent, Conor Cruise O'Brien. Collectively, this generation, and especially its Fianna Fáil members, were known as the men in the Mohair Suits, a slightly opprobrious reference to the expensive Italian threads without which they wouldn't have been seen dead. Along with this most un-Hibernian sartorial splendour went an entirely new set of attitudes. The change from Dev's generation couldn't have been more pronounced. Old-style politicians had been cautious, reserved, mostly representing rural Ireland, and low-key personalities as a rule. Their new style successors were brash, bumptious, disproportionately from urban constituencies in Dublin and Cork, often university educated, extremely self-confident, convinced that the world was their oyster, and well versed in the black arts of PR, presentation, and media manipulation. The TV studio and the press conference was their natural environment. In short, they were modern politicians with all that that implies. As it turns out, a fair number of them were thoroughly corrupt as well. They now began taking the three main parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, over. The smaller parties like Clann na Poblachta and Clann na Talún had faded into extinction during the 50s, and they began to remake the country in their own image. The results of that programme to modernise Irish society seemed to justify the effort. Emigration, the desperate social problem that had provoked Whitaker into action in the first place, fell from an average of 43,000 a year in the 50s to a relatively tolerable 11,000 per annum 10 years later. As a result, the continuous population drain that Ireland had experienced ever since the foundation of the state was reversed. The country's population actually grew by 150,000 between 1961 and 71. This was indeed the first increase in population since the Great Famine. During this decade, living standards grew by 50%, by half, accompanied by a corresponding expansion in social services. Free post-primary or high school education for all children was introduced by Lamass's Minister of Education, Donna O'Malley, in 1966, along with free transport to school for kids in isolated rural areas. As a result of this, the numbers in full-time education exploded. The university sector also was enhanced with the creation of the first new institutes of higher education, which eventually became Dublin City University and the University of Limerick. Equally importantly, the new colleges featured an emphasis on technology and the natural sciences to counter the liberal arts orientation of the old universities. Growing prosperity was also seen in more trivial measures. The number of cars and telephones more than doubled during the 1960s. The number of dwellings without running water fell from almost half to a fifth during the same period. Television came to Ireland for the first time in 1961 when RTE, Radio Telefíséireann, the state broadcasting service, began transmitting, albeit at the outset for only a few hours a day. We thought it was terrific nonetheless. By the mid-1970s, more than half of all households had TVs. A great deal of new commercial building took place in the cities, especially Dublin, almost all of which, from the architectural view, was bad. Indeed, one of the more remarkable developments of this era was the extraordinary growth of the greater Dublin area, which increased by a sixth between 71 and 78, the fastest growth rate of any European capital. This was not necessarily a good thing. In a country with a population as small as Ireland's, it meant that the capital city came to exercise a disproportionate and unhealthy degree of influence and importance in the life of the country, with an over-concentration of governmental and commercial functions and a corresponding detriment to the regions. Today, a bit more than a third of the entire country lives in the Greater Dublin area. Much of the new prosperity, as you will infer from that, was unevenly distributed, with the east-west divide in the country represented by the River Shannon becoming more pronounced than ever, as anyone who's ever driven the back roads of County Leitrim doesn't need to be told. One might expect that the rapid economic growth of the 60s would strengthen the hand of the party in power. But curiously enough, that wasn't actually the case. Fianna Fáil was in fact a minority government for about half of Sean Lamasse's tenure in office, relying on the goodwill of independents to keep going, though he did win a modest overall majority in the 1965 elections. Didn't give him too much leeway in the Oireachtas, but even so, there was no real danger of the government falling. Lamasse turned out to be a skillful crisis manager, avoided being put under serious pressure by the opposition, and was generally popular even among non-Fianna Fáil supporters as a kind of plain-spoken, plain-dealing individual, not as charismatic as Dev, but someone who kept a sometimes unruly team in one piece and successfully presided over the passing of the torch to a new generation. People responded to Lamasse very much, in short, as Americans did to President Eisenhower at much the same time. And Lamasse was also capable of the imaginative gesture. His visit to Belfast to see the Stormont leader, the Unionist Prime Minister Terence O'Neill, in 1965, making him the first Taoiseach to cross the border while in office. This was heralded as symbolising a new dawn in relations between the North and the Republic, as it turned out somewhat prematurely. His foreign policy was also reasonably astute. He kept on one of Dev's own old cronies, Frank Aiken, at Ivy House, for the sake of continuity, but the business of the department was mainly done by an extraordinarily talented cohort of young Irish diplomats, of whom Con Cremin and Freddie Boland would be the outstanding characters. Ireland now came to occupy a much more prominent role in international politics. In particular, she became a very active participant in the UN, serving a couple of terms on the Security Council and taking a leading role in peacekeeping operations. This tradition has continued to the present day. At the moment, Ireland, despite the small size of its army, has forces stationed under UN auspices in about a dozen different countries, ranging from Afghanistan to Congo and Syria. Lemass turned over the leadership of Fianna Fáil and consequently his job as Taoiseach to one of his younger ministers, Jack Lynch, in 1967. Lemass left rather sooner than he would have wished after 8 years in office, but he was already suffering the ill effects of the heart disease that would, in the end, kill him. Lynch, though younger, was very much in the same political vein. A balding, avuncular Corkman, a former GAA star with a national reputation as a sporting hero, be a bit like, I suppose, Joe Montana or Brett Favre going into politics, and a pleasant, uncontroversial style, a safe pair of hands. But unlike his mentor, Lynch was hardly an innovator, and as is now clear, he was also a great deal less adept than Lemass at keeping his subordinates in line, many of whom, like Charlie Haughey, had knives out for him because he had got the top job rather than they. Moreover, Lynch had the misfortune to take over at a challenging moment. Hardly was he in office before the situation in the north blew up, while the long post-war economic boom from which Ireland had benefited began faltering worldwide. The first serious domestic crisis that Lynch had to deal with was, as I say, the northern situation, and it's generally agreed that he made a fairly comprehensive hash of it. In August '69, as you know, the nationalist areas were being burned down by loyalist paramilitaries and at least some elements of the Stormont security forces. And as this was going on, Lynch hinted in a televised speech that the government might send the Irish army across the border to protect the victims. A foolish thing to suggest unless he meant it. As it turned out, he did not. Instead, several days later, the British Army showed up in Derry and Belfast. But many Irish politicians weren't putting all their hopes in that. They thought it would be just a temporary respite, and that something needed to be done to protect the beleaguered northern nationalists on a more comprehensive scale. In 1970, the Irish people learned what their leaders had been doing in this regard when 3 cabinet ministers, Charles Haughey, Kevin Boland, and Neil Blaney, were sensationally put on trial for having secretly supplied public funds, taxpayers' money, to buy weapons that they planned to smuggle across the border to Republicans in the north for defending the nationalist areas. The so-called arms trial, the trial of the century without question, sensationally collapsed when it became clear that although the 3 ministers had done exactly what they were accused of doing, the action that they took had been carried out with the prior knowledge and the tacit approval of the entire government. To save his own political skin, Jack Lynch was forced to throw the 3 overboard, to fire them, but the entire affair had been a deep embarrassment for him personally and for the Irish government and the Irish state more generally. An even greater problem, though, was mismanagement of the economy, which was, in fairness, a bipartisan effort. In an attempt to reduce unemployment in 1972, which was spiking rather worryingly, the government opted for a state-funded expansion of the economy, paid for by heavy overseas borrowing. This turned out to be an inauspicious time for something like this. A year later, the worldwide price of oil quadrupled, and the economy in the West as a whole went into deep recession. With international trade and overseas markets drying up, it was hardly the moment to embark on an expensive and risky top-down growth program. This is only the first, though, of a series of more drastic errors. In retrospect, we can only shake our heads at the economic irresponsibility of all three main political parties in the 1970s. Fianna Fáil, as I say, started the ball rolling with its all-out assault on unemployment through state spending, seemingly regardless of the inflationary pressures that resulted. Largely as a consequence of the failure of that campaign, and because the electorate was getting a little tired of Fianna Fáil after 16 continuous years in office, Jack Lynch lost the election of 1973 to a Fine Gael Labour coalition under Liam Cosgrave. It was this government that had to cope with the impact of the oil crisis, the worldwide quadrupling of oil prices, something that was especially damaging to Ireland, inasmuch as at the time she had no native oil or gas reserves and was heavily dependent on imported energy sources. Cosgrave's coalition was, as I say, the first non-Fianna Fáil administration since 1957, so its members were on the whole inexperienced in government. Unfortunately, that quickly showed. The economic policies of the Cosgrave coalition were little short of disastrous, seemingly without any kind of long-term objectives. The first budget, introduced by Cosgrave's finance minister, Richie Ryan, later to be lampooned as Richie Ruin, that budget projected a deficit of 1.5% of GDP. In other words, it proposed to spend £39 million more than the government would take in taxation, and to finance the shortfall again through foreign borrowing. At a time when inflation was already running at 11% per year, that mightn't have been a very good time to do such a thing. The only explanation that makes sense for Ryan throwing more petrol on the flames was that after being out of power for so long, Fine Gael and Labour were determined not to risk the displeasure of the electorate by making hard choices. Once having discovered this convenient formula of facing the consequences of their policies at some indeterminate point of the future, it became more and more difficult to renounce it. By 1975, just 2 years in, the government was financing not 1.5%, but 7% of GDP out of borrowing, which was then running at the catastrophic rate of £600 million per annum. All this back in the days when money was money. If we are to be fair, this was an extremely challenging time in the world economy. Nobody was handling the oil shock particularly well. But Cosgrave's coalition persisted in the policies it was following, even as every indicator showed or overwhelmingly proved that they weren't working. Inflation continued to spiral out of control. Wages increased 29.4% in 74, another 16.6% in 75. The country's foreign debt multiplied by a factor of 10 during the 4 years of Richie Ryan's tenure at the Department of Finance. Unemployment, 8% when he started, continued to rise until it had reached nearly 20%. Part of this, to be sure, is due to the fact that in 1973, Ireland did at last join the European Economic Community, the EEC, or today's EU, with dire results for uncompetitive Irish manufacturing industries. But those losses were counterbalanced by Irish farmers getting access to a guaranteed European market for their agricultural products, not to mention the receipt of large quantities of EEC foreign aid that was intended to bring poorer countries like Ireland up to the European average. Overall, EEC membership meant a considerable net gain for the Irish economy, and it certainly can't be considered any kind of excuse for Ireland's economic woes, which were almost entirely self-inflicted. Coalitions, or Cosgrave's coalition, fell in 1977, and you can't say that it didn't deserve its fate. But the Fianna Fáil administration that replaced it, again under Jack Lynch, took on the almost heroic task of making it look good by comparison. Lynch had taken a leaf from the coalition book and proceeded in a way that would have made Liam Cosgrave's father turn in his grave, or for that matter, Eamon de Valera himself, to bribe the electorate, not only with its own money, but with money the country didn't actually have. Fianna Fáil, promising to spend, won the election, as I say, 77, by the largest margin in the country's history, winding up with the biggest number of seats, 84 out of 148, that any Irish government had ever had. In a way, that may have been the worst possible result, because it meant that there was no effective check on the new government's power. The borrowing spree continued, indeed accelerated, with the same dire results as under the coalition. The balance of payments deficit hit an all-time high of 12.5% of GDP in 1981, by which time inflation was running at 20%, about twice the EU or the EEC average, and unemployment was up to 150,000. That in turn triggered the third great wave of Irish emigration in modern times, hence, among other things, my presence here before you today. Of course, this couldn't last, and in a way, the government turned abroad to compel it to adopt the self-discipline that it needed. In other words, have the international markets make the decisions that it didn't dare take. In 1979, the Irish pound finally broke the link with sterling and floated on the world currency market by itself, which was significant because from here on in, fiscal irresponsibility on the part of the Irish government would be punished with falling exchange rates. It was obvious, though, that the answer lay closer to home, and especially with the political leadership that had overseen the disaster. Both the electorate and members of his own party had the knives out for Jack Lynch, and in light of the fact that he was getting on in years anyway, in 1979 he decided to resign as Taoiseach and head of Fianna Fáil. His replacement, in a crowning irony, was Charles Haughey, one of the three ministers Lynch had heaved under the bus after the arms trial a decade earlier. Haughey was, by any measure, an extraordinary character and consummate political survivor, the archetypal man in the mohair suit. He was by trade an accountant, a graduate of University College Dublin, and a guy who, all too typically of his modus operandi, had got his start in politics by marrying Sean Lamass's daughter. In personality, he could be considered a kind of Richard Nixon with less malice and more style. He had a taste for the good life, cars, racehorses, a big house, private aircraft, good food and wine, congenial mistresses, which, none being affordable on a politician's salary, he allowed his wealthy industrialist friends to pay for, with backhanders running into the millions. This interesting fact only became known in the last years of his life, along with the significant intelligence that he had never declared any of these gifts to the taxman. If it hadn't been for the fact that by then he was suffering from advanced prostate cancer, which would soon kill him, Haughey would undoubtedly have crowned his checkered career in public life with a couple of years in Mountjoy prison. But while he was in office, he was the Velcro Taoiseach, surrounded with a bunch of cronies greatly like himself, who were aptly described as resembling a bunch of overdressed bookies' runners. There can be no question that he possessed considerable talents, both political and personal. But he was less a typical Irish politician than a Medici figure. Sophisticated, ruthless, amoral, and with an amazing ability to generate fervent loyalty and equally fervent antipathy in equal measure. The story of the 1980s was of the duel, the extended duel between Haughey, capable but shady, and Garret Fitzgerald, by now the leader of Fine Gael, recognised as Garret the Good but incompetent. As it turned out, even Garret the Good was in receipt of payments in the form of non-repayable loans maintained in offshore accounts, though the scale of his ethically dubious transactions didn't come close to those of Charlie Haughey. And Fianna Fáil's tenure in office under Haughey in the 1980s rapidly made the country an international laughingstock. A succession of bizarre incidents quickly came to light. One of Haughey's cabinet ministers, for example, was revealed to have borrowed bugging equipment from G2, Irish military intelligence, which he then used to bug his own colleagues to find out if they were leaking critical information about him to the press. A demented man who murdered a young nurse in a public park was arrested by the police. The place where they found him was the flat of the Attorney General, the country's leading law officer, who had lent it to the killer while he was out of town. For a while, episodes like this seemed to be happening almost every week. It's difficult to imagine that Holly could have survived these débâcles if Fine Gael under Fitzgerald, which was alternating in office with Fianna Fáil during the 1980s, hadn't been doing through ham-fistedness what Fianna Fáil was doing through Machiavellianism. But in the second half of the 80s, a succession of short-lived governments, which until 1986 had been pursuing a policy of fiscal cretinousness exceeded only by Italy, finally donned the hair shirt. Public spending was reined in, but only pushing unemployment even higher, ultimately to reach the calamitous figure of 300,000. It seemed, in other words, that whether interventionist or laissez-faire, Irish political leaders couldn't do anything right. But the darkest hours always before the dawn, and unknown to everybody, Ireland was about to take off on the most spectacular economic boom of her history. I'll tell you all about that next time.